The chandeliers of Devonshire House burned like captured suns, their 1,000 candles scattering gold across silk gowns and powdered faces. The season had reached its fevered height, and every titled whisper in London converged here, on the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshade. She stood beside him, a woman of poise and quiet elegance, her silver hair coiled in a soft Grecian knot, pearls glimmering faintly against the pale of her throat. Her name was Eleanor, and though she had once been the most admired hostess of Mayfair, tonight she was little more than a rumor still standing. The orchestra struck a waltz. The Duke, Alexander Ravenshade, tall, severe, and possessed of the kind of authority that made even gossip pause, offered her no glance. His eyes instead rested briefly on Lady Arabella Trenton, the young daughter of a baronet, whose laugh fell like a crystal bell into the murmuring crowd. Eleanor saw the shift in his gaze, and though her lips remained composed, something within her chest drew inward, like silk tightening around a wound. "Your Grace," murmured Lady Wentworth beside her, "how cruelly the candles expose us. I fear none of us fare well under so much light." Eleanor smiled gently. "Some truths, my lady, prefer to be seen." It was a brave answer, though her heart faltered even as she spoke. She could feel the eyes upon her, the assessing glances of matrons, the pity of younger wives, the sharp delight of debutantes who smelled blood in the water. A silver-haired duchess at 40, in a world that worshipped youth like a new religion, was already halfway to her grave. Across the ballroom, Alexander bowed to Arabella and led her to the dance floor. Gasps fluttered. The Duke of Ravenshade had not danced publicly in years, not since Eleanor's youth when she had been the one in his arms. The music rose. His hand, once hers, now rested on another's waist. She did not look away. A Duchess of England never flinched. But in that moment, as chandeliers blurred into a sea of fractured light, Eleanor felt her marriage quietly dissolve beneath her feet. By midnight, the air was thick with perfume and pretense. Laughter spilled through corridors, and the Duke vanished into a side salon, pursued by the watchful eyes of London's most ambitious mothers. Eleanor lingered near the window, where rain whispered faintly against the glass. The city beyond glowed with lanterns, indifferent and alive. She lifted a gloved hand to the pane, tracing the condensation with her fingertip as though she might write herself a future there. "Your Grace," came a voice behind her, her husband's secretary, young Mr. Penley, pale with discomfort. "His Grace asks that you retire for the evening. The carriage awaits." She turned. "Now." He bowed, his eyes avoiding hers. "At once, my lady." It was done. No confrontation, no cruel words, just the soft efficiency of exile. She descended the grand staircase under 1,000 painted eyes, each portrait of a noble ancestor bearing witness to her quiet undoing. Servants bowed without meeting her gaze. When she stepped into the night, the rain had turned steady, soaking through her thin shawl. The carriage wheels began to move, and the palace of light receded behind her. For the first time in 20 years, no hand reached to draw the curtain closed. She looked down at her lap, at the wedding ring that had become too heavy for her finger. The gold was worn smooth by years of hope. Slowly, she pulled it free and placed it into the small embroidered pouch she had carried since her wedding day. The gesture was simple, reverent, like returning something sacred to the earth. At dawn, she entered Ravenshade House for the last time. The servants lined the marble hall in silence. Her lady's maid, Margaret, wept quietly as she folded the Duchess's gowns into a modest trunk. From the study came the rustle of papers, the Duke's solicitor arranging terms of separation with mechanical precision. Irreconcilable appearances, the document read, as if beauty and loyalty could no longer coexist under the same roof. Eleanor signed. Her hand did not tremble. She thanked the solicitor, nodded once to her husband, who stood by the window, his expression carved from restraint, and turned to leave. Only when she reached the threshold did she pause. "Alexander," she said softly. He glanced up. "Yes, madam?" She looked at him, truly looked, at the man who had once recited poetry to her under candlelight, who had once placed her hand over his heart during a storm at sea. "I pray," she whispered, "that when history remembers us, it will not mistake silence for peace." He said nothing. The door closed. Hours later, London's morning papers would carry no mention of the divorce, only a note that the Duchess of Ravenshade has taken leave for her health. But among the ton, the story spread like wildfire, that age had claimed her beauty, that the Duke sought renewal in youth, that she had gone quietly. By evening she was on the Surrey road, the city shrinking behind her like a dream unmade. The carriage rocked through rain and fog, the rhythmic clatter of hooves echoing her heartbeat. She pressed her palm to her abdomen, not from pain but from a hollow ache that had lived there too long. The hills rolled past, soft and shadowed, the air filled with the scent of wet earth and distant lilac. When night fell, she slept fitfully and dreamed of music, of a ballroom filled with light and laughter that dissolved when she reached for it. She awoke before dawn to the cry of a nightingale and realized she was free, though freedom felt a poor substitute for love. Far away in a private club off St. James's, the Duke raised a glass with his peers. The talk was of politics, reform bills, and suitable alliances. He smiled, a thin, polite curve of the mouth. To the future, someone toasted. To youth, added another. Alexander's glass paused midair. For a brief, inexplicable instant, he thought of Eleanor's eyes, steady, unflinching, colored like rain on stone. The image unsettled him. He drank deeply as though wine could drown conscience. Outside, London continued to turn, carriages, laughter, fog, and all the glittering cruelties of the age. And somewhere beyond its reach, in a small cottage soon to bloom with spring, a dismissed duchess began again, unaware that within her life, quiet and miraculous, had already begun to stir. The cottage in Surrey was small, old, and touched by silence. Morning came slowly there, wrapped in the smell of damp wood and lavender oil. Eleanor woke each day before the light fully broke through the curtains, her hands finding the rhythm of domestic tasks that once belonged to servants, stoking the fire, washing linen, slicing bread with quiet precision. The sound of the kettle whistling had become her new orchestra. The hum of bees outside her window, her new ballroom music. She told herself she was content, though contentment often resembled surrender. Margaret, her faithful maid, remained with her still, a loyalty that had survived dismissal, distance, and shame. The older woman moved about the cottage with a protective watchfulness, as if afraid that grief might shatter its mistress like fine porcelain. "You're too quiet again, my lady," she would say gently, though Eleanor no longer allowed the title. "Mrs. Hayes," she would correct softly, her eyes downcast. "There are no duchesses here." It was spring now, tender and green. The meadows shimmered with dew, and lambs bleated beyond the low stone wall. To the few villagers who passed her gate, she was a widow of some means, a polite lady from London who preferred solitude. She played her piano occasionally, though the music faltered midway, as though the melody had lost its will to continue. Each afternoon she sat in the garden with a small sketchbook. The act of drawing steadied her, the curve of a petal, the shadow of a tree. Once she had designed gowns for court balls, embroidered lilies onto silk sleeves, chosen jewels to reflect candlelight on her skin. Now she sketched daisies. They did not wilt under scrutiny. Letters arrived sometimes, thin envelopes from old friends, written in tones of pity disguised as civility. She rarely opened them. Gossip, she knew, was a creature that fed on absence. London's salons would already be debating her replacement. Her husband's face, sharp, composed, untouchable, would appear beside another's soon enough. She had no place in that world anymore. Yet solitude had its unexpected mercies. Without the endless orchestration of society, her thoughts began to breathe again. At night, she read by candlelight, Wordsworth, Austen, a few psalms from her mother's Bible. She missed conversation less than she expected, and laughter more than she would ever admit. There were moments, fleeting and almost cruel, when she imagined Alexander's voice again, low, measured, almost tender, and wondered if she had imagined all the warmth she once thought she'd seen in him. Then one morning she fainted. It happened as simply as a leaf falling from a branch. She had been trimming lavender when her vision blurred, the scent of the flowers growing too sharp, the sunlight too white. The next thing she knew, Margaret was kneeling beside her, her hands trembling, calling her name. By afternoon, a physician arrived from Guildford, a kind man with gray whiskers and spectacles perched on his nose. He examined her gently, spoke little, and then smiled in that quiet, astonished way of one witnessing grace. "Madam," he said at last, "there is no cause for alarm. You are not ill. You are expecting." Eleanor did not understand him at first. The words seemed to drift from some other life, some other woman. "Expecting?" she whispered. "No, that cannot be." The physician hesitated. "It can, and it is. Nearly 3 months, I would say. A healthy sign." She sat very still. The world tilted. The hum of bees outside the window grew loud, insistent, like the beating of wings against her chest. After years of whispered prayers, humiliating doctors' visits, and polite condolences from matrons who birthed heirs with ease, this, now, when she was discarded, forgotten, 40, was when life had chosen to take root. When the doctor left, Margaret clasped her hands together and wept. "Oh, my lady, he must be told. His Grace must know." Eleanor's eyes hardened with a sorrow deeper than anger. "He gave me freedom, Margaret. I will not burden him with what he refused to wait for." That night rain came. It drummed softly on the thatched roof as she sat by the hearth, staring into the fire. Her hand rested over her abdomen, still flat beneath the folds of her nightgown. The flames shimmered against her silver hair, and she thought of how the Duke once traced that same hair with his fingers, calling it moonlight made flesh. Now that same light marked her as unfit for his pride. She whispered a prayer, not for him but for the small, silent life she carried. Days passed. Spring deepened into a season of secret wonder. She began to feel the faintest stirring within her, like a flutter beneath her ribs, a promise too delicate to name. She spoke to the child sometimes when alone, her voice low, filled with the tenderness she had not used in years. "You will not be unloved," she murmured. "Not while I have breath." In London, the Duke's affairs moved swiftly. Whispers reached Surrey through Margaret's brother, a footman in service at a Mayfair house. The Duke of Ravenshade was courting Lady Arabella Trenton. Their engagement was expected within weeks. Eleanor received the news without expression. Later, she stood by the window watching swallows dart between clouds, her hand again upon her abdomen. "He must be very happy," she said. Her tone was calm, but the stillness that followed was heavy enough to ache. It was Margaret who could not bear it. One evening, as Eleanor sat writing in her small parlor, letters she would never send, Margaret stole away to the village post. She addressed an envelope to Ravenshade Manor, London. Within it, she placed a note written in her own plain hand. "Your Grace, forgive the presumption, but her ladyship bears your child. She will not tell you. I could not live with my conscience if you did not know." The ink smudged slightly where her tears had fallen. She sealed it, prayed for forgiveness, and sent it with the next mail coach bound north. Eleanor never knew. She spent the following morning arranging wildflowers in a chipped vase, humming softly, a habit she had lost since London. The cottage filled with light, and for the first time in years she felt something close to peace. But in Mayfair, fate had other plans. The letter reached Ravenshade House 3 days later, addressed in clumsy handwriting, its seal cracked by curious fingers before it reached its intended recipient. The Dowager Duchess, Alexander's formidable mother, guardian of family honor, read it by the morning fire. Her lips tightened. Her son's fragile repute, newly mended by talk of a second marriage, could not withstand this scandal. Without hesitation, she tossed the letter into the flames. The paper curled, darkened, and vanished in a sigh of smoke. That evening in Surrey, Eleanor walked the garden paths beneath the soft rain. She felt the faintest kick, her child's first rebellion against silence, and smiled, unaware that the only bridge between her heart and his had just been reduced to ash. Rain had always carried memory for Eleanor. In London, it had polished the cobblestones outside her carriage, whispering against glass panes like secret applause. In Surrey it fell softer, filling the air with the scent of earth and lilac. She walked beneath it now, a shawl drawn close over her shoulders, her silver hair darkened to pewter. The path led toward the churchyard where her parents rested. The headstones glistened under the drizzle, and beyond them the hills dissolved into gray. She was heavier now, though not yet ungainly. Her hands curved protectively over the quiet swell beneath her gown, a secret the world did not deserve to know. The priest had gone, leaving only his footprints in the wet grass. She placed fresh lilies before the graves and whispered a prayer for guidance, though her voice trembled when she reached the name Alexander. Forgiveness was a virtue she understood in scripture but had not yet mastered in practice. The child shifted faintly beneath her palm, reminding her that life persisted even when love did not. A horse's distant tread broke the stillness. She turned. Through the haze of rain, a dark figure approached along the lane, tall, mounted, unmistakably regal in posture. Her heart stumbled once, painfully. He dismounted before the gate, gloved hands brushing the reins as if uncertain what to do next. Alexander Ravenshade, Duke of her former name, looked every inch the man society adored, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed, his black coat gleaming with rain. Yet there was something altered about him, a stiffness not of pride but of regret. "Eleanor." His voice, low and familiar, carried through the mist. It had been months since she'd heard it spoken toward her, and hearing it again felt like reopening a wound that had half healed. "Your Grace," she replied, the title falling like ice between them. "I did not expect a visit." He removed his hat. "Nor did I plan one. I am here on business concerning the estate. I was told you reside here. The words stung with their restraint. She gathered her composure, smoothing the folds of her shawl. You were told correctly. I live quietly. There is little for you to settle that has not already been taken from me. A silence followed, long enough for the rain to fill it. He stepped closer to the gate, hesitated, then said, You look well. Her lips curved faintly, not in humor but in disbelief. That is merciful of you to notice, Your Grace. He flinched, almost imperceptibly. The wind stirred his hair, loosening a strand that fell boyishly across his forehead, the same way it had on their wedding day when he promised her eternity. The absurdity of remembering that now made her throat tighten. I had not meant, he stopped himself, exhaled. I came only to ensure you were comfortable. The dowry lands are legally yours. I wish to see that they are kept in good repair. Your concern is noted, she said evenly, though inside, her pulse fluttered like a trapped bird. You may tell your solicitor that the roof does not leak, the servants are paid, and my needs are modest. That should suffice. He opened the gate without asking leave. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he crossed to her. Do you despise me so much you cannot even speak without thorns? I do not despise you, Alexander. The name slipped out before she could stop it. I pity you. The words landed softly yet struck with precision. His eyes, those storm-colored eyes that once looked through her and into her, darkened. Pity is crueler than hatred, he murmured. Cruelty, she said, is divorcing a woman for what time has done to her hair. The rain thickened. He stood before her now, close enough that she could see the fine tremor in his jaw, the faint lines at the corners of his mouth that power could not smooth. For a moment he looked almost human, vulnerable, uncertain. He reached out as if to touch her hand, but she stepped back, her palm instinctively covering her stomach. His gaze followed the motion, curious then puzzled. You are unwell? He asked. No, she swallowed. I am very well. He frowned, clearly unconvinced, but said nothing more. Instead, he turned slightly toward the graves. I remember your mother's kindness, he said quietly. She welcomed me when I was nothing more than a title looking for wealth. She deserved a better son than I became. The admission startled her more than anger ever could have. He had never spoken so plainly. The Duke of Ravenshade did not apologize. He amended, restructured, commanded. But now he looked at her with a strange humility that both unsettled and softened her resolve. I will not trouble you again, he said finally, voice roughened. London awaits, and I have intruded where I should not. Forgive me, Eleanor. Her name again, spoken not as possession but plea. She almost answered, but the words caught in her throat. He turned, rain cascading off his coat as he mounted his horse. Wait, she said before she realized she'd spoken. He looked back. Do you ever tire, she continued softly, of pretending the heart is a negotiable thing? He studied her, rain dripping from his hat brim. Every day, he said simply. Then he was gone, the sound of hooves fading into the mist. She stood motionless until the air cleared of him. Only then did she feel the tremor in her hands. She pressed them to her stomach again, whispering to the life within her, You must never learn pride as your father did. That evening she found herself unable to eat. The encounter replayed endlessly, the sorrow in his eyes, the question she hadn't asked. Had he come only for business or because some part of him still cared? She refused to dwell on it, but her resolve was fragile. Later, as she sat by the hearth, the wind lifted the cottage latch. A chill draft swept through, scattering papers across the table. Among them was the physician's note confirming her condition, the one Margaret had begged her to send north weeks ago. It fluttered to the floor, landing near the fire where its edge caught the light. She saved it just in time, pressing it flat against her chest as though it could still guard a secret that wanted to be known. In London that same night, Alexander entered his study. His valet handed him a stack of letters delivered from his solicitor. He flipped through them absently, correspondence, invitations, accounts, until one envelope, unstamped and addressed in a strange hand, slipped free. The seal was cracked, the edges singed as if nearly destroyed. Inside lay a single page. He unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was uneven, the ink faintly blurred by tears. Your Grace, forgive the presumption, but her ladyship bears your child. For a long moment he did not move. The world, all its clocks and chandeliers, seemed to stop breathing. Then, with a sound between a gasp and a prayer, he sank into his chair, the letter trembling in his grasp. Outside, thunder rolled across London as though heaven itself had turned its gaze upon him. The Duke of Ravenshade did not sleep that night. The letter lay before him on his desk, its edges curled by the warmth of the fire, its words seared into his mind until they blurred with the rhythm of his heartbeat. "Her ladyship bears your child." The phrase struck him again and again like the tolling of a clock he could not silence. At first he doubted, believed it a ploy, a cruel jest devised by some vengeful servant or gossip-monger. But no jest could twist his chest with this particular pain. He knew the script of Eleanor's fate too well, the quiet dignity with which she had left him, the barren years that had stood between them like a verdict. Now, impossibly, that verdict had been overturned. He rose abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. His valet appeared, startled by the sound. "Have the carriage prepared," Alexander said, his voice low and hoarse. "At once. We ride to Surrey." The journey began before dawn. The streets of London were still wet from rain, the cobblestones gleaming like polished bone under the flicker of gaslights. As the carriage hurtled through the gray morning, he saw his own reflection in the window, drawn, unfamiliar, aged by guilt. How many nights had Eleanor sat across from him at supper, her gaze searching for a trace of tenderness that he no longer offered? How often had he answered her silence with colder silence still? He had thought himself the victim of disappointment. Now he saw himself for what he was, a coward who had traded grace for vanity. By the time the spires of Guildford rose against the horizon, the air had turned sharp with wind. The countryside unfurled around him, wet fields glistening, hedgerows dripping with rain. He ordered the driver to hasten on, though every jolt of the carriage made the letter tremble in his coat pocket like a living thing. At last the estate came into view, a small ivy-wrapped cottage half veiled by mist. Smoke rose thinly from the chimney. He dismounted before the drive, boots sinking into the soft earth. For a long moment he simply stood there, his breath clouding before him. He had imagined grand entrances, reconciliations wrought with eloquence and pride. But now, faced with the humbleness of her dwelling, he felt unworthy even to knock. He did. The door opened not to Eleanor but to her maid, Margaret, older, plumper, her eyes widening in shock. "Your Grace," she stammered, bowing awkwardly. "Heavens above, I didn't expect." "Where is she?" he interrupted, his voice almost breaking. Margaret hesitated, wringing her hands. "She's resting, sir. The baby came 2 days past. It was early. We feared—" She stopped herself, tears glinting. He pushed past gently, his heart pounding. The cottage smelled of lavender, smoke, and faint iron. Upstairs, through a half-open door, he saw her, Eleanor, lying pale against the white of the sheets, her hair unbound, a candle flickering at her bedside. The sight of her stole his breath. She was thinner, fragile as spun glass, but her face held a serenity that undid him. Beside her cradle, wrapped in linen, slept a child so small it barely seemed of this world. "Alexander," she whispered without opening her eyes. She had felt him before she saw him. He crossed to her slowly, unable to speak. When she turned her face toward him, the ghost of a smile flickered at her lips. "You shouldn't have come." "Eleanor," he breathed, kneeling beside her. "Why did you not tell me?" Her hand, cool and trembling, lifted to rest on his sleeve. "You had no use for me, my lord. I thought you would have even less for my shame." "Shame?" His voice cracked. "This child is no shame. He is everything I prayed for." She looked at him then, truly looked, and for a heartbeat the distance between them vanished. But the pain returned almost as swiftly. "Prayers?" she murmured. "You ceased those long ago. You sought comfort in youth while I waited for peace." He bowed his head. "You are right." The confession fell from him like armor. "I was cruel. Not from malice but from fear. I mistook time's mercy for mockery. You deserved devotion and I gave you spectacle." She closed her eyes again, exhaustion stealing her strength. "Do not make poetry of repentance, Alexander. It is too late." "It cannot be," he said desperately. "I have lost too much already." His hand found hers, gripping gently, afraid that she might fade if he let go. The baby stirred in its cradle, a thin cry piercing the still air. Alexander turned, awe eclipsing every thought. He reached down, his large hands trembling as he lifted the tiny bundle. The infant's face was flushed, his fists clenched as though in protest of the world. Alexander stared, his own eyes reflected faintly in miniature, a fragile lineage he had thought forever denied. "He looks like you," Eleanor whispered, watching. "Though heaven grant he inherits your kindness more than your pride." Tears stung his eyes, unbidden and unrestrained. He knelt again, the child cradled against his chest. "Forgive me," he said quietly. I know words cannot mend what years have broken, but if you will let me stay, if you will let me care for you both. She smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth trembling. Care for him, Alexander. That will be enough. The midwife entered then, her expression grave. She checked Eleanor's pulse, her brow furrowing. She must rest, she said. No excitement. The fever has not yet passed. He rose reluctantly, laying the child beside her. I will not leave this house, he told the midwife. Not again. Night deepened outside. The wind rattled the shutters and candlelight trembled over the walls. Alexander sat by her bedside, listening to the uneven cadence of her breathing. He had fought duels, negotiated treaties, silenced Parliament with a word, but he could do nothing against this fragile stillness. When at last her eyes opened again, they held a soft clarity that frightened him. Promise me, she whispered, that he will know gentleness, that he will grow where love is not withheld. I swear it, he said. Her gaze drifted toward the cradle. Then perhaps God was not cruel after all. She drifted into sleep. He pressed his forehead to her hand, tears falling onto her palm. The child sighed, a tiny sound, and the cottage filled with that small music, the sound of life reclaiming space once given to despair. Outside, the sky lightened faintly. Dawn approached, thin and silver like her hair. The Duke sat still, his hands clasped around hers, his head bowed. He did not see the carriage arriving at the gate below, nor the servant descending with a sealed letter. Margaret received it quietly, her heart heavy as she read the seal, from the Dowager Duchess of Ravenshade. The message was short, decisive. Bring my son home. The scandal must end. The woman is no longer his concern. Margaret looked up toward the window where the Duke sat beside his sleeping wife and child, and for the first time in her life she defied an order. She tore the letter in two and fed it to the fire. The flames devoured it greedily, and for a moment the entire room glowed with light. Morning arrived slowly, as though uncertain it dared to touch the world that had trembled through the night. Pale light spilled across the floorboards of the Surrey cottage, gliding over a cradle and the weary figure beside it. Alexander Ravenshade had not slept. His coat hung open, his cravat discarded, his eyes hollowed by wakefulness. Yet in his arms the infant slept soundly, breathing with the fragile rhythm of new life. He had counted each breath as a form of penance, an act of silent worship before the altar of all he had nearly lost. The fire had burned low. Margaret moved quietly through the room, her footsteps soft as confession. She paused at the threshold, uncertain whether to speak. Her fever's gone down, she whispered at last. By God's mercy, she's mending. He exhaled a breath he did not realize he'd been holding. For the first time in years, gratitude filled him not as duty but as wonder. His gaze shifted to the small figure on the bed. Eleanor slept still, color faintly returning to her cheeks. Her hair, silver as frost, spilled over the pillow like threads of moonlight. She seemed at peace, and yet, there was fragility in that stillness that terrified him. Margaret continued, I sent word to the doctor. He'll be here by noon. Alexander nodded absently. When the maid left, he turned to the window. Beyond it, the hills glowed gold with dawn. For a man who had owned half of London, this modest patch of earth felt suddenly like a kingdom worth kneeling for. Hours passed before Eleanor stirred. He was at her side instantly, his hand brushing hers with reverent hesitation. Her eyelids fluttered open, confusion mingling with memory. Alexander? I am here, he murmured, his voice a vow. Her lips parted faintly. You stayed. There was nowhere else worth being. She studied him for a long moment, as though testing the truth of his face against her dreams. Then with quiet resolve she whispered, I dreamed of the river last night. When we first met. You rowed across the water just to bring me a glove I'd dropped. He smiled, faintly, painfully. I was young enough to believe gallantry could undo clumsiness. You were kind, she said softly. You forgot that somewhere along the way. He bowed his head. Yes, I forgot that love is not a performance but endurance. The child stirred in his cradle then, a small whimper breaking the silence. Eleanor's eyes moved toward him, and for the first time she smiled, unshakably, radiantly. He has your mouth, she said. But I hope he learns gentleness from someone else. Alexander laughed under his breath, though it came out like a sigh. He will learn it from you. No, she said gently. From watching you learn it. The simplicity of that sentence undid him. He sank to one knee beside her bed, his fingers brushing her hand as though it were glass. Eleanor, if you could see my heart now, If you knew how every breath since I read that letter has been repentance. Then stop confessing, she said softly. Live differently. That will be atonement enough. He could not speak for a moment, only held her hand until warmth returned to it. By afternoon the doctor came and went, declaring her recovery likely if she rested. Outside, the world blossomed with late spring. Birds darted through the hedgerows and wild roses opened along the stone walls. Yet within the cottage time slowed. The hours belonged to the three of them, mother, child, and a man relearning the meaning of devotion. He learned the weight of small things, the sound of the child's breathing, the feel of Eleanor's fingers tracing his wrist when she thought him asleep. Once she woke to find him sitting in the dark, watching her. "You're afraid I'll vanish?" she murmured. "I am afraid I already did," he replied. "Then stop being afraid," she said. "Stay." And he did. Days blurred into weeks. London clamored for its duke, but he ignored every letter, every summons. The dowager's commands went unanswered, the estate's business gathered dust. He milked cows badly, chopped wood worse, and learned to rock his son to sleep with an awkward tenderness that made Eleanor laugh until she cried. For the first time since their wedding, laughter filled the air between them. It was the sound of something long buried being unearthed. Still, the outside world would not stay quiet forever. News spread, first whispers, then bold gossip, that the Duke of Ravenshade had secluded himself with his former wife. Society, ever eager for scandal, spun its own mythology, that he had gone mad, that the child was illegitimate, that the Duchess had bewitched him. None of it mattered until a carriage bearing the Ravenshade crest appeared on the lane one grey morning. Margaret saw it first. "Your Grace," she said breathless, "it's your mother." He stiffened. "Tell her she is not welcome." But the Dowager Duchess of Ravenshade was not a woman accustomed to denial. She swept through the door moments later, draped in mourning black as though attending the funeral of his good sense. "Alexander," she said coldly, "the ton is laughing. Your name, our name, has become a jest. You must return to London. Leave this arrangement behind." Eleanor had risen weakly from her chair, her child in her arms. She met the dowager's glare with calm grace. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said softly. "Would you care for tea?" The older woman's lips thinned. "You mistake civility for welcome, madam." "I do not mistake anything," Eleanor replied. "Least of all the cost of pride." Alexander stepped between them. "Mother, you will not speak to her again with such tone. The Duchess is my wife." "Your former wife," the dowager hissed. "And that," she gestured sharply toward the child, "cannot alter the law." "Then I shall alter the law," he said simply. Her eyes widened. "You would disgrace us further?" He turned, his voice rising with a rare quiet power. "The disgrace was never hers, it was mine. And if London chooses to mock me, let it. For once I shall earn their laughter." The dowager drew herself up, trembling with fury. But something in his tone, the finality of it, stilled her. She left without another word, her carriage wheels vanishing down the lane. Eleanor's knees gave way, he caught her before she fell. "You have ruined yourself," she whispered. He looked down at her, smiling through tears. "Then let it be ruin. So long as you and our son are within it, it will feel like redemption." The child stirred between them, eyes fluttering open, gray, like the morning sky. Eleanor touched his cheek and then Alexander's. "He'll need a name," she murmured. "Edward," he said without hesitation. "After your father. A good man who knew what it meant to keep faith." She smiled faintly, exhaustion blurring her voice. "Then Edward it shall be." He pressed his forehead to hers. Outside, church bells from the village began to ring, a sound carried by the wind, bright and clear. In that moment, neither of them belonged to scandal or society. They belonged only to what remained, the fragile, miraculous ordinary. Weeks later, the family returned to London, not in shame but in defiance of it. The christening at St. James's drew the entire ton. Whispers filled the nave when Eleanor entered, radiant in white, silver hair unhidden. The Duke escorted her proudly down the aisle, his hand firm at her back, his son cradled in his other arm. When the priest asked, "Who stands as father to this child?" Alexander's answer rang through the church like thunder. "Alexander Ravenshade, husband of Eleanor, father to Edward, the heir of Ravenshade, and proof that mercy outlives pride." Silence followed. Then one by one even those who had gossiped lowered their heads. Outside, beneath a cascade of sunlight, Eleanor turned to him. "The world has not forgiven you." He smiled. "I do not require the world. Her eyes softened. "Only me? Only you," he said. The wind caught her veil, silver against the sky. And for the first time in years the Duke of Ravenshade, who once mistook love for ornament, understood what eternity truly looked like.